Hi everyone. So I'm here making a recording of today's class. This is lesson 1 in Intro to Saidic Coptic. I'm recording it by myself because something went wrong with the Zoom recording earlier when everyone was here. So now the students have all gone home, and I'm just going through it again so that there can be a recording on YouTube for anyone who wants to use it. So just to get started with today's agenda, I want to introduce myself. My name is Christian Casey. I finished a PhD in Egyptology about a year ago. I specialized in Egyptian language, and more specifically, I study the pronunciation of Egyptian languages and the way that that changed over time. So I'm especially interested in the reconstruction of the pronunciation of earlier Egyptian, and that's what initially led me to study Coptic. Coptic is the final stage of the Egyptian language, and it preserves pronunciation in a way that no other Egyptian writing system does. So it's very useful for people who study the sounds of the language. And I've studied Coptic for about 10 years now, and it's my favorite language in the whole world. So it's something that I really enjoy teaching. It's something I've always wanted to do. I've taught a few Coptic courses before, and this online course really came about because I spent a lot of time answering questions about Egyptian language on Reddit, and I was getting the same question over and over. I kept getting this question about, if I want to learn ancient Egyptian, where do I start? And that's kind of a difficult question to answer. There are lots of different choices, and I found that I was writing basically the same answer over and over again. So I'd write this really long answer where I put in links for all the different sources and things. And after I did that several times, I started to think that I should sort of shortcut that process. There's no reason to be writing the same answer over and over. So I created the Ancient Egyptian subreddit as a place to direct people when they asked about how to learn Egyptian. And then through my involvement with that, I noticed more and more interest in learning Coptic. People often ask about how to learn Coptic. And then another Reddit user, Brap Waffles is his name, created a post on the Duolingo forum and linked to it on Reddit. And the goal is to create a Coptic Duolingo. So I participated in that discussion a little bit, and I saw that so many people were really interested in learning Coptic. And I like teaching Coptic, and I love talking about Coptic. And it's good, it's a good learning experience for me too. So I thought, well, I'll teach a free online course. Just kind of open it up. I got about 80 people registered for the first course. So I'm not sure how many of those people I saw today because I lost count, but quite a few people. I was sort of expecting maybe a dozen people to show up at the first class, and maybe, half a dozen to stay with it for the long haul. But I ended up getting a lot more than that. So I split it into multiple sessions. I'm going to be recording at least one of those sessions every Saturday and putting it onto YouTube so that people who had to miss that day can go look at it, or, whoever's watching this may be someone far in the future who is interested in learning Coptic and wasn't able to attend the class. So you can use this. I'm going to be going over the lessons in the book and going through a quick presentation. If this had been the actual class, we would take a moment for all the students to introduce themselves and explain their interest in Coptic. But again, they've all gone home, so we're not going to do that. And then the last thing I want to say is, because of the huge amount of interest I found in this subject, and because I would like to spend more time doing it, I also created a Patreon page. And that's, I don't really know how that's going to work out. It's kind of just, seems like it's worth a shot. If so many people are interested in coming and learning Coptic that they're willing to support it, then that's something that I can spend more time on. And like I said, it's my favorite thing to do. So it's kind of that classic case of, find what you love and find a way to make money doing it. So maybe enough people want to learn Coptic that I can do it for a living. And that would be really neat. Okay, so I'll put a link to the Patreon page in the video description or something. Okay, so just getting started. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully all the recording and everything works. There's me trying to figure it out. We'll just get started with the presentation. So this class is Introduction to Saidic Coptic. The reason that we're doing Saidic Coptic is because there are so many English language textbooks on the subject of Saidic Coptic. The reason that there are so many textbooks on Saidic Coptic is because this is the dialect that Western Egyptologists tend to study the most. The oldest Coptic texts are written in the Saidic dialect. It was a literary dialect. There are quite a few documentary texts as well. That's everyday letters, receipts, contracts, that sort of thing. Those tend to be in Saidic Coptic. And it was also long believed that there were no ancient Bohairic texts. So the Bohairic dialect is the one used by the modern day Coptic Church, generally not used by Western scholars, because they believed that there were no ancient texts in that dialect. It was believed that all Bohairic texts, the earliest Bohairic texts dated to the 10th century AD. We now know that that's not true. We found much earlier Bohairic texts, but the damage was kind of already done. The standard dialect for Egyptologists is Saidic, and so that's where all the textbooks are. And so that's what we're learning in this class. One of the first things I should say is that the choice of dialect really doesn't matter that much when you're learning. All the grammar is the same, and actually moving from one dialect to another is really easy. The way I explained it to my students in class earlier is if you imagine that an American, British person, I'm sorry, someone from the United States, a British person, and an Australian each wrote English exactly as they pronounce it. If you were to read those different writings, you would be able to tell which dialect it was written in, and you'd be able to see the differences between them. But if you speak English fluently, all of them would be perfectly legible to you. They're all mutually intelligible. So there's really not a big issue for understanding. It's pretty easy to move from one Coptic dialect to another. They're quite similar. So if you're interested in learning Coptic because you are religiously Coptic, or because you're an Egyptian who wants to participate in the revival of the Coptic language, this class will help you with that. And it won't be an issue that it's Saidic and not Bohairic. So that's what we're doing. Just to set up some brief context, Egypt, of course, is in Africa. It's at the top right of your screen. Still haven't figured out how to point to things and zoom, so it's up there. You can see it. We're going to zoom in. For the sake of our discussion, Egypt is understood to be the green arable land along the Nile River and in the Nile Delta. So today we often think in terms of nation states, and we imagine these kind of bounded regions of land. And of course, Egypt's borders today include this big area of land that is mostly desert. And that a lot of people in the United States, for example, have the impression that Egypt is just a big giant desert. If you watch any Hollywood movies that are set in Egypt, everything will take place mostly in the desert. That's largely just because people think the desert looks cool. But when we're talking about Egyptian civilization, everything is taking place in this lush green farmland along the river. And that's why I chose my opening image to be this date palm forest with adobe buildings, because that's the sense of Egypt that I want you to have, the Egypt where people actually live. And I'm just going to zoom out a little bit and use this schematic map to describe the different geographic regions and to place the dialects roughly onto a map of Egypt. So no one knows for sure where the dialects were located geographically, but this gives you kind of a rough idea. It's at least approximately correct. So we have Bohairic, which is the liturgical language of the Coptic Church, was spoken in the Delta. Fayumic in the Fayum, of course. Oxyrhynchite and Lycopolitan in Middle Egypt. Saidic in the area of Thebes, and Akhmimic further south, further up the river. That's the general idea. Those are the 6 major dialects. Among those, Bohairic and Saidic are the most common. And it's likely that Saidic was an urban dialect. So we can imagine it being spoken in Thebes, which was one of the largest cities in Egypt, but also in the north in Memphis and maybe even in Alexandria. It was probably a sort of unified urban dialect. And the comparison that I used in class today was the dialects of American English. So in the United States right now, the dialect of English that I'm speaking, the dialect that most people in highly populated areas speak, is fairly uniform. So I'm recording this from Houston, Texas, and you probably would not know that from the way I'm speaking. And that's just because I speak an urban dialect of American English. That's fairly uniform. We can imagine ancient Egypt being fairly similar. It's likely that a similar dialect was spoken by people in Thebes, Memphis, and at this time, Alexandria, because there was a lot of communication between major urban centers. And the rural areas in between tended to have more distinct dialects because there was less everyday contact. So this is a timeline of Egyptian scripts. It is to scale. So at the far right-hand side of the screen, that represents the present day. And we can see the placement of Egyptian scripts on this timeline. And the major takeaway that I was hoping for from this figure is the incredible scale of Egyptian history. So something like the Second Intermediate Period on this chart, that was roughly the same length as the entire history of the United States. So we're dealing with massive timescales here. The hieroglyphic script was used for more than 3,000 years. And the beginning of the hieratic script, so at the left of this chart, that's roughly 3,200 BC. So this is 5,000 years of history shown. And that just gives you kind of a sense of how everything is connected and when the different stages of the language were used and how much time we're dealing with. And then, because a lot of people who are taking this class are interested in earlier stages of the language, I also included this evolutionary tree of the different Egyptian scripts. So there's quite a lot here. The main kind of center line is the hieroglyphic script, which again persisted for a very long time. And then off of that developed the handwritten script hieratic, which originally was just like hand-drawn hieroglyphs with ink on papyrus. They look very much like hieroglyphs. And then from that, Egyptian scribes developed more cursive forms of hieratic, and then that persisted all the way into Demotic. When we place Coptic on this chart, it ends up off the chart, really. It is not directly part of this evolutionary tree. It is ultimately descended from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but it took a different route. So the Phoenician or Paleo-Hebrew alphabet derived from a pictographic alphabet that was invented on the basis of Egyptian hieroglyphs. And then that was adopted by the Greeks and modified to become the Greek alphabet. And then Coptic is based off the Greek alphabet. So it's kind of an indirect relationship. It ends up kind of coming in and supplanting this whole evolution. The book we're going to use in this class is Introduction to Saidic Coptic by Thomas Lambden. I've taught Coptic a few times, and normally when I put it to a vote, people select Leighton's Coptic in 20 Lessons. In this case, because I was kind of starting from scratch and because I was making the class all by myself, I didn't ask anyone else's opinion, and I just chose Lambden's book because, in my opinion, Lambden's is a much, much better book. The main advantage that it has for new students is that Lambden uses really standardized grammatical terms, whereas Leighton uses grammatical terms that are not only non-standard for Coptic, they're sort of non-standard generally. So for instance, what he refers to as the Coptic preterite it's not the Coptic preterite, it's not even a preterite at all. It is what Lambden calls the imperfect, and it is what is objectively in general terms, an imperfect tense. So Leighton tends to use words to mean the exact opposite of what they would mean in any other context. So it creates a lot of confusion for new students, and I just wanted to avoid that. So in this class, we're using Lambden, and I nixed the idea of using Leighton from the beginning. If you're taking this class and you want to study alongside Leighton, you're welcome to do so. You should bring up the terms, and we should discuss the differences in terminology, but we will use Lambden's terminology as a matter of course. And then the last thing I wanted to mention just at the beginning before we really get started is the historical connection between Coptic language and Christianity. So when Christianity first developed in Egypt, there was a fair amount of iconoclasm. So a lot of early Egyptian Christians actively rejected pharaonic culture. They rejected the older stages of the language. And of course, they rejected the ancient Egyptian religion in favor of Christianity. And I use this image just to illustrate that. Here we have a Coptic cross that's been carved directly onto an ancient Egyptian monument, and they've carved it right on top of the hieroglyphic scripts. So there's an element of destructiveness to this that I won't go into a lot, but basically just to illustrate that the Coptic script was really a rejection of earlier Egyptian scripts. And then with the Islamic conquest, Arabic became the language of the ruling class in Egypt. It's closely associated with Islam. And Arabic eventually supplanted Coptic as the spoken language of Egypt, but Coptic survived as the liturgical language of the Coptic Church because it was still being used by Egyptian Christians who did not convert to Islam. So there is a historical connection between Coptic language and Christianity. It's really more than anything a historical accident. There is nothing inherently Christian about the Coptic language, and there's nothing religious about this class. The class is open to people of all faiths and creeds. And I'm not advocating any sort of religious standpoint. So that's just a brief introductory lecture to get you started on Coptic. Now, the last thing I want to do in this video is to just run through the reading assignment. So the reading assignment for this class was to read the introduction in Lambden's book. And one of the first things that you have to do as you read that is learn the Coptic alphabet. So I'll say again what I told my students. Do not try to memorize this chart. Just as you're starting out, use this chart to figure things out and just get started reading. Find examples, read them aloud, figure out what they say, and use the chart only so long as you need to. The secret to learning new alphabets is to read. There's absolutely no advantage to trying to memorize the values of these symbols. It doesn't work. You won't be able to learn to read that way. It will take a lot of time. It's very tedious, and it won't help you. So just use the chart to figure things out. So in class today, we went through a few examples just to test it. So what I suggested that we do is take these examples where Lambden has given you a pronunciation and just cover up the answer and try to pronounce it yourself. So this is ten sotem, and you can check, see that it matches. Storter matches, tevt, and kremrem. And there we go. So we practiced that together in class, and you should definitely do more practice. We talked a little bit about stress. Coptic likes to put the stress on the final syllable or the ultima or the penultima. So either the last syllable or the next to last syllable, depending on the word. Lambden gives us a really great example here that I broke down in terms of etymology. So this root, ako, has something to do with destruction or to be destroyed. Tako is a causative verb. It's like to destroy or to cause to be destroyed. Tako is, ot is sort of like the English suffix less. It means like without destruction or not destroyed. So this is destructionless. The ment prefix makes an abstract noun. So it's like the English suffix ness. So this is like destructionlessness. Te is the definite article, so the destructionlessness. And then F is the possessive, and this is the way Coptic forms possessive phrases. So tef ment at tako means his destructionlessness. And then hen is a preposition that means in. So putting it all together, we get hen tef ment at tako, in his destructionlessness. So it's quite a mouthful, and it shows how Coptic likes to chain together all of these prefixes to make a compound phrase. And it also shows how there's really only one primary stress on this entire super long phrase. It's on the last vowel. We looked at a few other things in here that I'm not going to go over. They're fairly minor points. You know, the way Coptic spells Greek words, interesting topic, but something we're not really going to go over in detail right now. And then getting to lesson one, I'll just go over that very quickly. we're looking at Coptic nouns. First, we're looking at gender. So there are two genders in Coptic, masculine and feminine. Often that gender corresponds to natural gender. So for instance, the word yot, meaning father, is masculine because obviously fathers are male, and ma'u, mother, is feminine because mothers are female. But then there's also grammatical gender, which is fairly arbitrary. I won't say it's completely arbitrary because there is a sort of a common cultural understanding of gender that also relates it to other concepts, but it is largely arbitrary and you have to learn it for each noun. So for instance, the word ka, meaning earth or ground, is masculine, while the word pe, meaning sky or heaven, is feminine. The word ha'u, meaning day, is masculine, while the word ushe, meaning night, is feminine. For the most part, Coptic nouns are not inflected for gender, but there are some exceptions, especially family members. So the word son, brother, is the masculine version. The feminine version of that same noun is sone. And this is a really common morphological feature of Coptic. The feminine will tend to have this final epsilon. And then if there is a stressed vowel, it will tend to be lengthened in the feminine. There's lots of discussion over what exactly the difference between omega and omicron is. I'm not going to go into that for right now. We're going to pretend for the sake of argument that the difference is length. So it's son, short o, and sone, long o. A few other examples of irregular gendered nouns. Shere and shere is son or daughter. Hella or hello is old man or old woman. In this case, the morphology actually comes from the fact that this is a noun adjective compound, and it's actually the adjective that is being inflected for gender. So that's why you get this o pattern. And then we have another example that's actually in the same pattern as son and sone. It's uhor and uhore, where again we have that feminine epsilon at the end and omega as the stressed vowel. There's also irregularity in singular and plural nouns. For the most part, Coptic marks the singular or plural using the article, which we don't see here. But there are some cases, especially family members, where there are irregular plurals. So the singular for the word father is yot, and yode is the plural, fathers. The singular for brother is son, as we saw before, but sneu for brothers. And this works sort of like the way the English word brother works. So in English, we have the word brother as the singular, and then for the plural, you have the choice of either brothers or brethren, where brothers is just the regular plural that most people use every day, and brethren is this older, irregular, sort of more formal plural. And you select which one you want, kind of based on register or context. But again, most of the time we say brothers. In the case of Coptic, most of the time they say sneo. So it's just, you know, the habit to use the irregular plural for that word. So as you can see from our examples, there are basically three types of Coptic nouns. There's masculine singular, feminine singular, and plural. The plural actually doesn't differentiate gender. And if you've ever studied other stages of Egyptian, especially late Egyptian, this is what we call the patana paradigm. And I just jotted it down really quickly in class because I haven't learned to use the whiteboard feature in Zoom. So there it is. It's the patana paradigm, and you can see how that manifests itself in Coptic. We have pa as the masculine singular definite article, ta as the feminine singular, and n as the plural, right? That's so patana, basically. And the way the articles work is that they just go onto the front of the noun. So rome means man, prome means the man, nrome means the men. And you can see an example of what I mentioned before. For the most part, Coptic nouns aren't inflected for number. It's really the article that tells you. So for the singular, we use pa. For the plural, we use n. Same thing with a feminine noun, chij. Chij is the hand singular, and enchij is the hands plural. There is some assimilation especially in the plural article. So what Lambden is showing you here is really two features at once. We have the irregular plural. So the singular of the word sky is pe. The plural is pewe. So it's the noun actually is inflected. And then the sky singular is at pe. The skies or the heavens plural is, we would expect enpewe, but of course the n assimilates to the following p and becomes empewe. And this is something that you're familiar with if you're an English speaker, because you see it in words like incoherent and impossible. So the in that in prefix becomes an m before the p in the word impossible. This assimilation. Same thing happens in Coptic. Ma'in sign is ma'in or emmain instead of enmain. Then the last thing I want to point out in this chapter is that words that begin with two consonants use a slightly different form of the article. So here for shime, woman, we would expect shime, just a T right on the front of the word, but the rules of Coptic pronunciation forbid more than two consonants in sequence. So anytime you have more than two consonants, you have to insert a short vowel to break up that consonant cluster. So in this case where we have TSH, we get this epsilon in there to break up the consonant cluster. So it becomes teshime. And throughout the class, you'll see enough examples of that it will become natural. So the grammatical subject of this chapter is adverbial sentences. Coptic, like all other Afroasiatic languages, doesn't require any kind of verb in adverbial sentences. The way it expresses this idea is just to put the noun and the prepositional phrase together, or the noun and the adverb together. So when I say adverbial sentences, I'm talking about sentences where there is a subject and an adverb, or a subject and a prepositional phrase. And this is considered adverbial because a prepositional phrase behaves like an adverb. It's basically interchangeable with an adverb. So prome hip joy is the way Coptic says the man is on the ship, but literally it translates to the man upon the ship. There's no to be verb in that sentence anywhere. Teshime hempei, the woman is in the house. There is no, the word is does not occur in the Coptic sentence, literally the woman in the house. And in JUML, the ships are there. Again, no to be verb, it's just the ships there. There's a vocabulary section at the end of every chapter. I strongly encourage you to memorize all of this vocabulary before moving on to the exercises. And then for next week's class, which will be on Saturday, September 12th, 2020, we will go over the exercises together. All that you need to do for homework is just read through them and make sure that you know all the words and at least try to translate them. So for instance, if I were going through this myself, I would just read them to myself. For instance, A1, hitehye, on the road. 2, hipdo, on the mountain, etc. And then the next time in class, I will call on students at random and ask you to do the same. So if you're called upon and if you get everything exactly right, for number 1, you would say hitehye, on the road. Hopefully, ideally, you don't get everything right. Maybe you make a mistake in pronunciation, or you make a mistake in your translation, and that gives us an opportunity to dig into this example and explain all the parts of it and understand exactly how it works. So a big part of what we'll do going forward is to go through exercises like this, work on them together, make mistakes, figure out our mistakes, and learn along the way. So again, this is just me running back through the class that I wasn't able to record earlier. I hope that it has been helpful, and I hope that everyone has enjoyed it, and I will see you all next week.